My name is Nora Blake, and I am 20 years old. That fact seemed to be the source of most of the amusement in the room. In the sterile, mahogany-panelled office of my late grandfather's estate lawyer, I was the odd one out. The cheap, durable fabric of my jacket felt abrasive against the plush leather of the chair, a chair designed for people who measured their worth in stock tickers and property deeds. I was surrounded by them, my so-called family. My Uncle Robert, his face florid and smug, already mentally counting the zeros in his new portfolio. My Aunt Carol, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, adjusting a diamond bracelet that could have paid for my entire education 4 times over. And my cousin Marcus, just a few years older than me, but already radiating the oily confidence of someone who had never worked a day for anything he owned. They were vultures in bespoke suits and designer dresses, and I was the inconvenient field mouse at their feast. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, was a man who seemed carved from old, wise wood. He peered over his spectacles, his voice a dry rustle of paper as he read my grandfather's last will and testament. The air was thick with performative grief and very real greed. He began with the significant assets. To Robert, the controlling shares of the manufacturing empire grandfather had built from nothing. Robert gave a solemn, practiced nod, as if accepting a heavy but righteous burden. To Carol, the sprawling penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, a place of legend in our family lore, filled with art and memories I was never invited to make. She dabbed a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. To Marcus, perhaps the most coveted prize of all for a young man of his disposition, the entire collection of vintage automobiles. A stable of perfectly restored metal beasts, Ferraris, Aston Martins, a singular, priceless Bugatti. Marcus couldn't suppress a grin, trying to twist it into a somber smile and failing miserably. They murmured their thanks to the memory of a man they had, in my opinion, barely known. They saw him as a bank vault to be cracked, and now, finally, the door was open. I watched them, feeling a familiar, dull ache of otherness. I had loved my grandfather, or at least the version of him I knew, the gruff, quiet man who smelled of engine oil and sawdust, who taught me how to read a blueprint and how to respect the integrity of a well-built structure. He had been distant in recent years, consumed by his world of wealth, a world I had no key for. Then, Mr. Davies cleared his throat. The atmosphere shifted. This was the final item, the footnote, the afterthought. Me. And to my granddaughter, Nora Blake, he read, his voice carefully neutral, I leave the property known as Blackwood Reach, located at the end of Old Hemlock Road, along with all structures and debts thereupon. Silence. A thick, unblinking silence that lasted for 3 full seconds. Then it broke. It was not a chuckle or a snicker. It was a wave of open, unrestrained laughter. Marcus was the first to crack, a loud, braying sound. Aunt Carol joined in, a high, piercing titter that sounded like breaking glass. Even Uncle Robert, the patriarch in waiting, let out a deep, rumbling guffaw. Blackwood Reach? Marcus choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. Isn't that the old fishing shack? The one the river took back in the big flood 10 years ago? The one with the 5-figure tax lien and the condemnation notice, Carol added, her voice dripping with venomous pity. Oh, Nora, you poor thing. He's left you a hole in the ground to pour money into. Uncle Robert held up a hand, playing the part of the magnanimous victor. Now, don't you worry, Nora, he said, his tone oozing condescension. Family helps family. We'll all chip in to cover the demolition fees for you. It's the least we can do. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up my neck. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the heavy glass of water at his perfectly capped teeth, but I didn't. I had learned long ago that the only victory they couldn't take from me was my composure. I looked straight at Mr. Davies, ignoring the chorus of their mockery. I gave a single, sharp nod. I accepted. The lawyer's eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and I saw something in them, not pity, something else, respect, or maybe just professional duty. He pushed a folio of papers across the polished table toward me. The deed, the tax notices, the red-stamped condemnation order. And resting on top of it all, something small and heavy. Your grandfather specified this was for you and you alone, Mr. Davies said, his voice low enough that it was nearly lost beneath my family's continued celebration. It was a key. It was not a modern house key, thin and serrated. This was old, iron and ornate, with a complex clover-leaf-shaped head and a thick, solid shaft. It felt substantial in my palm, a small, cold anchor in a sea of derision. I signed the documents, my hand steady. I took the folio and the key. I stood up. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look at them. I just turned and walked toward the door, the sound of their laughter, a physical force pushing me from the room. It followed me down the hall, into the elevator, and out onto the cold city street. It was the sound of my family, and it was the last sound I ever wanted to hear from them. The drive to Blackwood Reach took 4 hours. 4 hours of grey highway giving way to winding country roads, and finally to a gravel path that was more suggestion than road. My old pickup truck, a machine I understood and trusted, rattled over the potholes. With every mile, the city and its polished cruelties fell away, replaced by the deep, damp quiet of the woods. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and something else, something like decay. I replayed the scene in the lawyer's office, over and over in my head, their laughing faces, the sheer, unadulterated joy they took in my public shaming. Had my grandfather really intended that? Had he become so detached, so cruel in his old age, that his final act was to set me up for this spectacular humiliation? The man who taught me how to use a wood plane, who praised the sturdiness of my first handmade bookshelf, could he really have left me a pile of debt and rot as a final joke? The thought soured in my stomach. Maybe I had never known him at all. The gravel road ended abruptly, or rather, it disappeared into a wide, stagnant sheet of brown water. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the drone of insects. I got out of the truck, my boots sinking slightly into the soft mud, and there it was, Blackwood Reach. Marcus hadn't been exaggerating. It was a shack, and it was flooded. Not just a little bit, not a puddle in the yard. The water, dark and opaque, came right up to the windowsills, turning the property into a small, dismal island. The cabin itself was a study in dereliction. The wood of the walls was blackened with mold and age. The porch sagged into the water at a drunken angle. The roof, covered in a thick carpet of moss, had a spine that looked broken, dipping dangerously in the middle. Trees, choked with wild vines, crowded in on all sides, their branches scraping against the decaying structure like skeletal fingers. It was worse than I could have possibly imagined. It wasn't an asset. It was a corpse, a monument to neglect. The air hung thick and still, smelling of algae and decomposition. This was not a fixer-upper. This was a tear-down, and a complicated, expensive one at that. Uncle Robert's condescending offer to help with demolition fees echoed in my mind, and for the first time, a wave of genuine despair washed over me. I was a student of architectural restoration. I spent my days studying the bones of old buildings, learning how to save them, how to honor their history. I could look at a structure and see its story, its strengths, its fatal flaws. I waded into the cold, knee-deep water, the chill seeping through my jeans, and made my way to the cabin. I ran a hand over the waterlogged siding. It was soft, pulpy. The foundation, what I could feel of it with my boot, seemed to have shifted in the saturated earth. The cost to drain the property, stabilize the foundation, replace every single piece of rotted wood, and deal with the inevitable legion of environmental and code violations, it would be astronomical. The tax lien was probably the least of its problems. It was hopeless, utterly and completely hopeless. My grandfather had not just insulted me, he had strapped a financial millstone around my neck. He had given my cousins and uncle the keys to the kingdom, and he had given me the bill for its sewage system. I stood there, in the murky water, the silence of the swamp pressing in on me. A profound exhaustion settled deep in my bones. I felt the fight drain out of me. They had won. The whole greedy, laughing pack of them had won. The easiest thing to do would be to get back in my truck, drive away, and never think of this place or my grandfather again. I could declare bankruptcy on the property, let the county seize it, and try to forget this entire chapter of my life. I sat on the hood of my truck, my wet jeans chilling me to the bone, and I seriously considered it. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But then my hand, resting in my jacket pocket, brushed against the key. The cold, heavy, intricate key. It felt solid and real in a way that nothing else about this situation did. It didn't feel like a joke. Why would he go to the trouble of leaving me a specific, unique key for a building that was little more than a pile of wet firewood? Why not just leave the deed? Why the theatrical flourish of a single key, just for me? It was a loose thread in a story that otherwise seemed brutally simple. It was an anomaly, and my grandfather, an engineer by trade and a meticulous planner by nature, was not a man who dealt in anomalies. Everything he did had a purpose. A spark of something defiance, maybe, or just stubborn curiosity flickered to life in my chest. I wasn't done yet. I wouldn't let them have the satisfaction of knowing I walked away without even trying to understand the puzzle. I slid off the hood of the truck and waded back toward the cabin's sagging porch. If my grandfather had left me a lock, I was going to find what it opened. The porch groaned in protest under my weight, but it held. I made my way to the front door, which was swollen shut in its frame. I ran my hands along the door frame, then along the adjacent wall, feeling for anything out of the ordinary. My fingers, numb with cold, brushed against something hard and metallic, hidden behind a loose, peeling piece of siding. I pried the siding back, and there it was, a small, square plate of what looked like brushed, stainless steel, perfectly flush with the wooden wall. It was utterly out of place, a piece of modern marine-grade hardware on a 19th century ruin. In the center of the plate was a keyhole, a complex shape that matched the iron key in my pocket. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. This was it. This was the lock. I took the key, its weight feeling more significant than ever, and slid it into the keyhole. It was a perfect fit. I turned it. There was no rusty, grinding sound. Instead, there was a smooth, satisfying click, followed by the faint hiss of decompressing air. A section of the wall, about 2 feet square, popped open, revealing a dark, watertight compartment. I stared into the small, dark space. My breath held tight in my chest. This was no simple lockbox. Inside, neatly packed and perfectly dry, was a compact but professional-grade set of diving gear, a low-profile rebreather, a full-face mask with a built-in light, a pair of fins, and a weighted belt. It was all top-of-the-line equipment. Beneath the gear was a heavy, laminated roll of paper, sealed in a waterproof tube. My hands were trembling as I pulled the tube out and unscrewed the cap. I unrolled the paper on the relatively dry surface of the porch railing. It was not a map. It was a set of architectural blueprints. They showed the cabin, but as a simple outline, the real detail was below it. They depicted a multi-level subterranean structure, vast and complex, built directly beneath the cabin's foundation. It was a feat of engineering, a hidden world. My eyes, trained to read such documents, scanned the schematics. I saw ventilation systems, power conduits, and what looked like reinforced vault doors. And on the first level, in the center of the room, directly below the cabin, a single, prominent notation. An arrow pointed to a specific spot on the far wall. The label next to it read, "Primary Drainage Control, Manual Lever." It all clicked into place, with the force of a physical blow. The flood wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of a storm or a broken dam. It was deliberate. The water was a lock. A massive, impenetrable, terrifying lock. And my grandfather had just given me the key. He wasn't testing my wallet or my patience. He was testing my courage. He was testing whether I, the quiet girl who loved to build things, would have the nerve to dive into the dark water to find what he had built. A cold, sharp thrill, equal parts terror and exhilaration, shot through me. This was no longer about a derelict shack or a tax lien. This was a challenge, a final, audacious puzzle from a man I was only now beginning to understand. The decision was instantaneous. There was no other choice. To walk away now would be a failure far greater than the humiliation I had suffered in that office. It would be a failure of nerve, a failure of spirit. I was going in. Putting on the dive gear felt surreal. The neoprene was cold against my skin. I strapped the rebreather on, the unfamiliar weight awkward on my back. I checked the gauges, full tank. I pulled the mask over my face, the silicone sealing against my skin. With a flick of a switch, the built-in lamp came to life, cutting a brilliant white circle in the deepening twilight. I took a breath through the regulator. The air tasted sterile, metallic. It was the sound of a different world. I slid off the porch and into the black water. The cold was a violent shock, stealing my breath for a moment before the neoprene began to do its work. The weighted belt pulled me down, and I submerged completely. The world vanished, replaced by a murky, silent, green-brown gloom. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic rasp of my own breathing and the frantic drumming of my heart. I pushed open the cabin's front door. It swung inward with a waterlogged groan. I kicked my fins and propelled myself inside. The beam from my headlamp sliced through the darkness, illuminating a scene of suspended chaos. A wooden table floated near the ceiling. A chair lay on its side, draped in algae. The water was filled with swirling motes of dust and debris, like a morbid snow globe. It was a sunken tomb, the grave of a forgotten life. I consulted the blueprints, which I had tucked inside my suit. The layout was simple. One large room. I needed to get to the far wall. I swam through the spectral, floating furniture, my light dancing across the slime-coated walls. The silence was immense, pressing in on me. It was easy to get disoriented, to feel a surge of panic. I focused on my breathing, on the simple mechanics of moving through the water, on the goal, and then I saw it, exactly where the blueprints said it would be. Bolted to the far wall was a massive iron lever, at least 3 feet long, with a heavy, round handle. It was an industrial piece of machinery, something you would expect to see in an old factory or a dam, not in a fishing cabin. It was coated in a thin layer of slick algae, but underneath it looked solid, powerful, and ready. I swam up to it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was the moment of truth. I gripped the handle with both hands. The iron was brutally cold, even through my gloves. I pulled. Nothing. It was completely solid, as if it were part of the wall itself. I readjusted my grip, wedged my fins against the floor for leverage, and threw my entire body weight into the pull. My muscles screamed in protest. The lever didn't budge an inch. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. What if it was rusted shut? What if, after all this, the mechanism had failed decades ago? Was this the final, cruelest twist of the joke? I refused to accept it. I took a deep, calming breath, the rebreather hissing softly. I tried again, not with brute force, but with a steady, sustained pressure. I poured all my strength, all my frustration, all my desperate hope into that one motion. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I felt it. A deep, resonant groan, a vibration that travelled from the lever, through my arms, and into my very bones, the sound of immense, ancient gears turning somewhere deep in the earth. The lever began to move. It was impossibly heavy, fighting me for every inch, but it was moving. With a final, desperate heave, I pulled it all the way down until it locked into place with a deafening clang that echoed through the water. Immediately, a new sound began, a low, powerful hum that quickly grew into a deafening mechanical roar. The water around me began to move. I looked toward the center of the room and saw the surface beginning to swirl, forming a small whirlpool. The pumps were working. The cabin was draining. I scrambled out of the water, pulling myself back onto the porch, my body trembling with cold and adrenaline. I tore the mask off my face and gasped in the damp night air. The roar from below was immense, the sound of a hidden giant waking from a long slumber. I watched, shivering, as the water level inside the cabin began to drop. It was slow at first, an inch at a time, but then it accelerated, the whirlpool in the center becoming a furious vortex, sucking the black water down into the earth. It took hours. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket from my truck, and watched the water recede, revealing the muck-covered floor, the ruined furniture, the secrets of the cabin's drowned life. And as the last of the water vanished down a large circular drain in the floor, it revealed what lay beneath, a solid steel hatch, 3 inches thick, with a large spoked wheel in its center, like the door to a bank vault. My exhaustion was gone, replaced by a thrumming, high-frequency energy. I climbed down into the muddy cabin. The air was thick with the smell of river mud and wet rot. I walked to the hatch and put my hands on the wheel. It turned smoothly, the gears within it clicking with satisfying precision. After several full rotations, there was a heavy thud as the locking bolts retracted. I took a deep breath, gripped the edge of the hatch, and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted on a hydraulic hiss, opening onto a spiral staircase that descended into perfect, silent darkness. A draft of cool, clean, sterile air washed over my face. It was the air of a tomb, but a modern one, a place sealed away from time and decay. It smelled of concrete, steel, and electricity. I grabbed my flashlight from the porch, took one last look at the ruined cabin around me, and started down the stairs. The staircase was made of polished steel, and it spiraled down further than I could have imagined. My footsteps echoed in the enclosed space. The walls were smooth, reinforced concrete. This was not a basement, it was a bunker. After at least 50 feet of descent, the staircase opened into a vast, cavernous space. I flicked on my flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a swath through the darkness, and then I found the light switch on the wall. I flipped it. A series of lights hummed to life overhead, flooding the space with clean white light. And I saw. My breath caught in my throat. I was standing in a place that shouldn't exist. It was not a bunker. It was a museum, a treasure vault, a private kingdom. The space was immense, at least 10,000 square feet, with a soaring 30-foot ceiling. The air was climate-controlled, cool and dry. The floors were polished concrete, and arranged throughout the space was a collection that defied belief. To my left, an entire wall was lined with museum-quality art. I recognized a Picasso from an art history textbook, a Monet, its colors impossibly vibrant. A chaotic, beautiful Jackson Pollock. These weren't prints, they were the real things, priceless masterpieces hidden from the world. To my right, rows upon rows of industrial steel shelving groaned under the weight of stacked gold bullion, the bars gleaming with a soft, buttery light. There were crates filled with rare coins, glass cases displaying historical artifacts. I couldn't even identify ancient manuscripts, gleaming artifacts, things that belonged in the Smithsonian. In the center of the room was a collection of vintage motorcycles, each one a pristine, perfectly preserved specimen of chrome and leather. Beyond them, racks of wine and casks of whiskey, many of them labeled with dates from the 19th century. This wasn't just wealth. This was a curated collection of history, beauty, and power. It was a dragon's hoard, assembled with meticulous care and hidden beneath a drowned shack. I walked through the silent hall of wonders in a daze, my mind struggling to process the scale of it all. This was my grandfather's secret, his real life. The businesses, the penthouse, the cars, they were just the surface. This was his heart, his passion, and in the very center of the vast room there was a single, elegant mahogany desk. On its polished surface sat one item, a thick, leather-bound folio. Embossed on the cover in simple gold leaf was my name, Nora. My legs felt weak as I walked to the desk and sat in the leather chair behind it. My fingers trembled as I opened the folio. Inside was a letter, 20 pages long, written in my grandfather's distinctive, sharp, architectural script. My dearest Nora, it began. If you are reading this, then you have done it. You have passed the test, and you have proven that I was right about you all along. I read the letter, and the full scope of his grand, audacious, and vengeful plan was laid bare. He wrote that he had spent the last 20 years of his life watching his family devolve into a pack of grasping, shallow materialists. They saw his fortune as their birthright, something to be consumed and squandered. They had no appreciation for the work, the ingenuity, the sweat and sacrifice that had built it. They only saw the end result, the dollar signs, but he had watched me. He had seen me, the quiet, overlooked girl who would rather spend a weekend rebuilding a carburetor or framing a wall than going to a party. He saw my fascination not with owning things, but with understanding how they worked, with restoring them, with creating them. He saw in me the same spark of the builder, the engineer, the creator that had driven him his entire life. He wrote, "They see a building as a price tag. You see it as a set of bones, a system, a story. That, Nora, is the difference between an owner and a custodian. And I needed a custodian for my legacy. The cabin," he explained, "was the perfect filter. It was a worthless, debt-ridden wreck on the surface. To Robert, Carol, and Marcus, it was an object of scorn, a symbol of failure. They would never, in a million years, see it as anything other than a liability to be disposed of. But he knew that I, with my builder's curiosity and my stubborn refusal to be beaten, might look closer. He knew I might see the anomaly of the steel plate, that I might have the courage to use the key and face the dark water. The flood was the guardian of the gate, designed to repel the greedy and reward the brave. Then came the final, devastating part of his plan. The inheritances he had left to my relatives were not gifts, they were traps, poison pills, engineered with the same meticulous care as his vault. The controlling shares in the company he left to Robert were tied to a subsidiary shell corporation that held billions in hidden, off-the-books pension liabilities and environmental cleanup bonds that were about to come due. The moment Robert claimed ownership, he would be personally liable. The Manhattan penthouse he gave Carol came with a massive, undisclosed lien against it, collateral for a disastrous private loan he had taken out under a pseudonym. The creditors were scheduled to foreclose within the month. And the cars he gave Marcus? They were part of a brilliant sting operation. Grandfather had discovered his original collection was being replaced with flawless forgeries by a high-end theft ring. He had worked with the FBI for a year, letting them replace the entire collection with fakes equipped with tracking devices. The ownership papers Marcus signed were the final pieces of evidence the federal agents needed to move in. "Their greed will be the hammer that springs the trap," he wrote. "They will sign the papers without reading the fine print, so eager to claim their prize, and in doing so, they will author their own ruin. I did not earn my fortune just to watch it be devoured by fools. This vault, Nora, everything in it, is my true estate, and it is all yours, legally, untraceably, and absolutely. Use it to build, to create, to restore. Live a life of purpose, not of possession. That is my final wish." I finished the letter, the pages trembling in my hands. Tears streamed down my face, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of shock, of vindication, and of love for the brilliant, complicated, and fiercely protective man I now truly understood. The next few months were a blur of calculated action. The letter contained detailed instructions, a roadmap for my new life. On the desk was a satellite phone. My first call was to Mr. Davies. When I told him I was in The Legacy, his entire demeanor changed. The dry, professional lawyer was gone, replaced by a warm, conspiratorial ally. He had been my grandfather's confidant for years, the only other person who knew the full plan. He was my guide. Following the instructions, I used a single, untraceable gold bar to pay off the cabin's tax lien in cash. Then, Mr. Davies helped me hire a discreet, elite security firm to protect the property. While the world above saw a condemned shack, my real home was a fortress. Then, the real work began. My work. I didn't just want to live above the vault. I wanted to build a home worthy of it. I hired a small, trusted team of local craftsmen, and with the near-limitless resources at my disposal, I began the restoration of Blackwood Reach. I led the project myself, drafting the new plans, working alongside the crew. We didn't just repair the cabin, we resurrected it. We lifted the entire structure, laid a new, unshakable foundation, and rebuilt it using the finest materials, honoring its rustic history while infusing it with modern strength and beauty. It transformed from a symbol of my humiliation into a magnificent piece of architecture, a testament to what could be built from ruins. My home, meanwhile, just as my grandfather had predicted, the traps began to spring. The news came in fragments, first from Mr. Davies, then in the business sections of the newspapers. Robert's company imploded in a spectacular bankruptcy, crushed by the sudden revelation of its toxic debts. He was facing lawsuits from thousands of retirees. Then, Carol's face was splashed across the tabloids, pictures of her belongings being hauled out of the penthouse onto the street after the foreclosure. The public humiliation was total. The final piece was Marcus. A dramatic pre-dawn raid, federal agents swarming the garage where he kept his prized cars. He was charged with possession of stolen property and involvement in a massive fraud ring. They lost everything. Their money, their homes, their reputations, their entire world, built on a foundation of arrogant entitlement, had crumbled to dust, and they had been the ones to light the fuse. About a year after the will reading, a battered old sedan I didn't recognize made its way up my long, newly paved driveway. It stopped before the handcrafted gate of my estate. Robert, Carol, and Marcus got out. They were unrecognizable. Robert's expensive suit was replaced by a frayed jacket, his face gaunt and grey. Carol looked a decade older, the bitterness etched into her features. Marcus was a ghost, his smug confidence replaced by a hollow, haunted look. I met them on the wide stone porch of my new home, the very spot where they had expected to find a ruin. They stared at the house, then at me, their eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, hateful comprehension. Robert found his voice first. "You," he snarled, his voice a ragged whisper. "This was you. You conspired with him. You set us up. You stole our inheritance." Carol started to cry, a pathetic, grasping sound. "Nora, please," she begged, switching tactics when the anger failed. "We're family. You can't let this happen to us. We have nothing left." "You have to help us." I looked at them, the three architects of their own destruction, standing on the foundations of the joke they had found so funny. I felt no anger, no pity, nothing but a vast, cold distance. I let the silence stretch out, letting them stand in the shadow of the magnificent home built on the ashes of their mockery. Then I spoke, my voice calm and even. "I seem to recall your offer of assistance to me," I said, meeting Robert's eyes. "I believe your exact words were, 'Don't you worry, Nora. We'll all chip in to cover the demolition fees.' It appears you're the ones who might need some help with fees now. Bankruptcy fees, I imagine. Legal fees, certainly." Their faces crumpled, the last vestiges of their pride shattering. They had no response. There was nothing left to say. I did not wait for one. I turned my back on them, on their ruin, on the entire miserable past they represented. I walked back into my beautiful, solid home, and I closed the heavy oak door behind me. The sound of the latch clicking shut was crisp, final, and deeply satisfying. It was the sound of the end of their story and the true beginning of mine.